But so yes, I was at Philadelphia University, and even before that, it was called Textile.
Okay.
So it was a small, really textile-focused school that started in around the centennial in 1876 and added design in the 70s, 80s, 90s, right? So I've been.
Looks like we're live.
Yep.
Okay, good. So yeah, we're already deep in conversation, which means we're going to have a really good conversation in this time that we're together. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Engineering for Good. This is a live program that's focused on fun and insightful exploration of all things related to engineering and design. I'm your host, Dr. Darryl Williams, Senior Vice President of Science and Education here at the Franklin Institute. And so just really quickly kick some things off how this works. We're live up here, Facebook Live. If you have questions, comments, want to get involved in the conversation, please use the chat function. And my colleagues on the other side will help us manage your questions, and we'll make sure we try to get to all of them as we progress through the program. Other than that, we're going to just have a lot of fun. I have an exciting guest with us today. I'll introduce him in a minute. But I do want to set the conversation up. Today, we're talking about sustainable design. And so when I use that term, sustainable design, and really in the context of the built environment, what does that even mean? That's a loaded phrase. And so we're going to unpack what sustainable design actually means. When I talk about the built environment, that basically means the human design world. In relation to sustainability, it's issues related to how we ensure sustainability throughout that entire process. So our guest today is going to help us unpack some of these things, and really we're going to get into the nitty-gritty about sustainable design. So I'm going to introduce our guest. Our guest today is Professor Robert Fleming. He is the Salaman Family Chair in Sustainable Design and Professor of Sustainable and Integrated Design at Thomas Jefferson University, where he is the co-creator and director of the university's award-winning Master of Science in Sustainable Design program. Professor Fleming has a long established career in architecture and sustainable design, and he has authored a number of books on the subject, with the most recent collaboration entitled Sustainable Design Basics, published by John Wiley & Sons this year. Welcome to the program, Professor Fleming.
A pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit too at some point, hopefully, about this book that you launched this year on sustainable design basics. But first, I want to kind of, I don't want this to be like a stuffy conversation. So I want to get to know you a little bit, if you don't mind. So I have it's like these little icebreaker questions, a quick couple of questions here. So first question I want to launch into is, when did you know that sustainable design or sustainable architecture was where you would want to point your career?
Yeah, so that's a great question. This was back in the mid-90s, 1995. I was in a graduate class with one of my professors, and she started talking about this concept called sustainability. I'm like, what is that? And within 10 minutes, Darryl, I was sold on the concept because I knew that this is what we needed to do. And from that moment on, 24 years later, I'm still practicing and teaching sustainable design. And next year will be my 25th anniversary. So you'll be invited to the party.
Oh, that sounds awesome. So prior to that, though, before you heard the term sustainability, like what was the impetus for you even considering architecture or considering that as a pathway?
Well, I mean, I was one of those kids that knew he was going to be an architect from age 5. So that was an easy one. And I actually graduated from Temple with a bachelor's of architecture, loved it, practiced for 7 years, got registered, and started to think that something wasn't right, that the buildings we were making weren't getting the job done. And I wasn't really using the term sustainability, but I just felt like there was something more. So I went to graduate school, and that's where I was introduced to the concept by one of my professors. And from there, I continue to do architecture and teach, but this is where I am now, yes.
Okay, very good, very good. So then if you were to, do you have a hashtag for how you promote sustainability? Is there a certain hashtag? And if you do, what is it? And if you don't, I'm going to kind of put you on the spot and say, could you come up with one off the top of your head?
Yeah, so the hashtag I use on LinkedIn is the future of sustainability. And so all of my posts have that. And I think that really captures me. I'm all about the future, and I'm all about how we can get a sustainable future. I have spent my whole life doing that. So that is the hashtag that I've been going with.
That's a great hashtag. Actually, those of you watching, if you have any hashtags that related to sustainability, feel free to put them in the chat because we'd like to hear what those hashtags are. So that's really fascinating. So then also too, so you're in this, design world, you've been practicing this for some years. So I have two terms here and you let me know which describes you. Would you consider yourself to be a creative or would you consider yourself to be a disruptor?
And I'm not allowed to pick both, right?
All right. Hey, I mean, it's your world, Rob. It's your world.
Listen, disruptor is, I take issue with the term disruptor a little bit, but I would put myself in that category. When people are getting annoyed by me, Darryl, and when my ideas are making people uncomfortable, that is my reward. And that is when I know I'm on the right track. If I present to someone about sustainability and they're like, oh, that's nice, then I know that I haven't pushed the boundaries. So as you get to know me, you'll know that every boundary that is to be pushed, I will be pushing it.
So you're provocative.
That's an understatement. That is correct.
Well, maybe we'll learn a little bit more about what that actually looks like today. Sure. And then my last question, then we'll get into more of the technical stuff is, how would you describe your Jenga game? Are you good at Jenga?
That is a great question. I've played Jenga many times with my kids, and just so you know me a little better, I never let my kids win in anything in my entire life. So when they beat me in Jenga, let me tell you, it was a party, a celebration in the house because they legitimately beat me, and I went off and cried in a closet. I am a very competitive person. I would say that I don't have the patience to be a consistent winner in Jenga. I'm always looking at the next move, but I'm a little jumpy. You can already tell that I like to jump around a lot. So I'm not a superstar in Jenga.
Okay, well, maybe we can play a game together when we know where it's safe to do.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, we can actually try have you ever seen the big giant Jenga? Yeah. They look a little dangerous, honestly, but
they do.
Yeah.
Sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having fun and answering some of those questions.
Sure.
So let's dive in. So this term sustainability, sustainable, it's used so much.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean? What does it mean to be sustainable?
Darryl, this is a tough one for me because I think, unfortunately, people perceive it as a buzzword. And unfortunately, it's often used as a buzzword. But the truth of the matter is that sustainability and sustainable development are really the next great wave of societal evolution. We're not talking about incremental change and nipping at the edges of energy and environment. We're talking about a transformation in how we view the world and how we view ourselves in the world. And so when I use the term sustainability, sustainable development, sustainable design, I am looking for a paradigm shift. I am looking to change the model. We can dig into that a little bit more. But the last thing I would say, a lot of folks are really doing green. When they say we're sustainable, they're really greening, meaning they're taking their initial or their normal stuff and they're getting a little less bad, right? Mm-hmm. They're saving 10% energy, they're saving water. And look, I love that. I'm glad people are doing it, but I don't want to be just less bad. I want to get to a sustainable future that is radically different and radically good.
Got it. It's so interesting too, because it's like, so I have the Nest app in my house, and the Nest app, of course, gives you your monthly statistics and everything, and it tells you, you get leaves depending on how well you're managing your energy, things of that nature. And as a competitive person such as yourself, I sit there and I get frustrated because I'm like, what do you mean I'm doing as well as 50% of the households? And I'm like, I feel like I'm doing a much better job at managing energy and relating that to sustainability. But I really think too, part of this is like, how do people really make sustainability a practical part of their lives? And that it's not just this academic conversation or this conversation that people are having in the business world, but it's really down to the everyday. And I really think that is it a messaging thing? Is it just, I'm not sure what it is.
This is a tough one, Darryl, because unfortunately, sustainable design is often associated with wealth. And those who have the money to buy the Tesla, to buy the solar panels, to do all that stuff. I just want to say I'm okay because those wealthy early adopters are paving the way for folks that have less means and less opportunity to get those electric cars, right? To get the solar panels. So I've had solar panels for 14 years. I had an electric bill for $14 one month, right? But that was because I had a privileged position. However, everything is getting so much cheaper, Darryl. Solar panels are 90% less costly than they were 10 years ago. And at the same time, refrigerators and TVs are 90% more efficient. And this is the connection that people don't make. When you buy efficient equipment, you're creating and saving energy. And then when you think about that associated with photovoltaic panels, which are not super efficient, they become more efficient by the things you do in your house and the way you live. And do you keep the lights on? And do you have those LED bulbs, which cost too much? I know people go to the supermarket like, I can't pay $5. But that is one of the real keys is long-term thinking, Darryl. You have to project your decisions forward. And we are not hardwired for long-term thinking.
So Rob, let's dig into that, because I'm touching on something that's really important. In order for sustainability to really create change, it's got to be accessible to everybody.
Absolutely.
And so how it can't just be for the folks who know about it or can afford it, but it's got to be part of the everyday and practical way of life for everybody. So how do we think about accessibility with regard to sustainability? And then actually my other question too is, where does design play? How does design, what role does design play in the execution of sustainability and that idea around accessibility?
Yeah, so Darryl, the first part of that is vision and mindset. A lot of folks want to keep their current mindset and not do any changes. So we got to change the way we think, whether we're wealthy or not. We have to change the way we think long-term, think globally, and think about the decisions we make on a daily basis, what kinds of spin-off effects. And that is, honestly, we're not hardwired for that. We are hardwired to get food here now. We are still creatures in the landscape trying to survive. Sustainability is an abstract, esoteric, far off concept. You know, the polar bears are dying. We're never going to see a polar bear, right? So part of it is we got to make this more real. We got to make this more personal. Part of that is you can do it with food, when you buy a car, when you buy a light bulb, when you do anything, you can put that lens on, that sustainability lens, and actually start to get some impacts over the long term. Again, very difficult to do. You'll catch me not recycling once in a while, right? I am not perfect, and we have to let that go a little bit. But so the accessibility part comes from enough critical mass. We need 22% of all people buying into sustainability, and the rest of it sort of waves out. And everybody else kind of gets behind the early adopters. So for example, electric cars, Darryl, you never thought that electric cars would do what they're doing. And within 5 to 10 years, most people are going to be driving electric cars. It can happen, and it is happening. But you've got to take a broader view. You got to look at the big picture, right? So yeah, I think it's there, and it's there every day. Like I said, the refrigerator that you buy now, 90% more efficient. That's because people like me have spent 25 years yelling and screaming, right? So the advocates are a really big part of the work you're doing. You're doing it right now. You're starting to change the paradigm with the show and the guests that you have.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. So let's talk more about design, because I think design is also one of those terms that is, people hear it and it means different things to different people. So how does design factor into this, and how do you use design to move your ambitions and your agenda?
Yeah, well, think about this. Think about the races, the yacht races. They have these wealthy people race these yachts across the bay. And it turns out that the team that wins has the best boat, not the best crew, because the crews are pretty much equal. And the ships and the buildings are going to perform based on how the designer and the design team is thinking about the long term and the performance of that. And so design actually is really critical. You know, you think about the Prius. Remember when the Prius came out, how ugly it was? Terrible looking car, right? I had one for 13 years. It was a brilliant car, but it was ugly as sin. It was the shape of that Prius was perfectly shaped so that when you drive down the highway, the air just rolls over it and you get 5 more miles per gallon, right? If you notice, most hybrids have the same shape because the engineers have figured out that from a design perspective, that shape is going to be performative. So what's new in design is design used to be coolness and functionality and maybe comfort. And now we've added performance to the mix. Not every designer is equipped to have that lens to think about performance first. They want to make the cool statement, the ego statement, the cool building, the cool car, and then they try to jam sustainability in the last minute. It looks very applied. It's not efficient. So we're looking at sustainable design like sustainability is a complete paradigm shift in how designers approach what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. It's really transformative.
So this is fantastic. And I think as you were talking, I was reflecting on my time when I was a professor at Tufts in the School of Engineering, and we introduced a freshman, a first year course on engineering design, but we were looking at it through the lens of art. And it was at that particular time when the university had merged with the Museum of Fine Arts, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, School of Museum of Fine Arts. So it was like an opportunity, really, I think, of a lifetime to be able to collaborate with the art school and then the engineering school and create a course that would teach students about form and function, and particularly as a first year course for them, where they don't have all of the nitty-gritty details, nuances of all the engineering and the sciences and the math, but really looking at it sort of, let's step back and let's just look at this from a pure, foundational, like how do you define form? What does it mean to create form, the aesthetics? What does it mean what does function mean? And then how do you combine those two? What's the balance of form and function? So it sounds very similar to this idea as you were describing with electric cars. It's like performance and functionality tied to the aesthetics of it. It's really, important in terms of design philosophy.
Yeah, and I use the term holistic. I know that's a hippie word, and you think about people smoking marijuana when you hear holistic, right? But holistic thinking is not there. Many folks are stuck in their discipline, Darryl. So that course that you were running was really critical in breaking down the barriers between the disciplines. Engineers and artists have to work together to create something sustainable. And I'll tell you why. Really, the simple reason why is, I would argue, if it's not beautiful, it's not sustainable. So if you look at buildings that persist and stay, some buildings are renovated over and over again, right? Some cars are taken care of, and other things are in the landfill, right? So we've learned over time that beauty is an essential ingredient to achieving a sustainable or persistent design element. And that is really important. So what we have to do, Darryl, is break down the barriers between the disciplines. Engineers have to think like artists. Artists have to think like engineers. And that's called transdisciplinary design.
I wanted to ask you about that term.
Yeah, we'll get to that. So I'll stop there, and then you can ask a question on that.
Well, yeah. So first, I think for the audience, we should probably define what that term means. But then I'm curious what it actually looks like in practice, because there's a continuum of learning, right? If we're talking about this in the context of learning, and then also in the context of practice. And so you can have interdisciplinary, which obviously means you've got different that's coming together. Transdisciplinary, obviously, not obviously, because it's not obvious to everybody. Transdisciplinary is, right, it's that you're taking it a notch above that. And you're saying, how do you achieve and think outside the box? What's the unknown? And how do you merge these different components to transcend beyond, right?
Right. There's no doubt about it. I mean, one of the real concrete examples out there is, for one day, a doctor is a nurse for a full day to get the perspective of the nurse. And if you could, you would do it vice versa. There may be some legal issues. Architects doing interior design, interior designers designing buildings, engineers going outside of their zone to do art. We've got to get people out of their comfort zone and seeing the design challenge from different perspectives. And so what I do as a professor is, I have a program where I don't care what your major was before you came. Everyone is a designer who wants to make things better. So we have engineers in our program, we have architects, interior designers, business folks, entrepreneurs, and we're all working together. And we just shed all of those boundaries, except when we need some specific expertise. Like engineers really good at calculations, right? So when we're calculating water efficiency, hey, Mr. Engineer, we need some help. But the engineers love it when the designers, the artists help them with the creativity part. So we've given up on all of the territory, we've given up on the ego, and we're all working together, which requires a deep level of facilitation ability. So what you're seeing now is transdisciplinary design requires facilitation. And so, Darryl, you've probably heard of something called design thinking, which is a new way. And that design thinking is not what architects do. There's a misnomer there. And we could talk about design thinking, but we're changing the way we approach design fundamentally so we can get to sustainability and get to sustainable design. Not easy to do, but it can happen.
And we can talk some about design thinking. I'm also curious too, where does systems thinking come into this?
Yep.
Is that part of the process?
Yeah, so I put systems thinking underneath the umbrella of design thinking. I mean,
Okay.
all of our students at Jefferson are drawing systems diagrams. And before we draw, we dig into why is something not working. And we use I can't draw it for you with my fingers, but there's a whole bunch of interrelationships that we have to define that ultimately impact our environment, energy use, et cetera. And I think at the core of sustainable design is really a deep level of systems thinking, for sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you're just talking about your students, talking about Philadelphia as a laboratory, right? Are there any projects that you have worked on in the past, or current projects, or even thinking about the future that are sort of models for, and potential game changers for the work we're talking about today? Are there any examples you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, Darryl, there's so many examples. And one thing I was thinking about is there's a gentleman named Tim McDonald who's an architect doing projects in Old City, and he designed what's called a net zero ready house, meaning that the house generates enough energy to not only provide all the energy the house needs, but actually export energy back to the grid. And this is what I was talking about. That's not a less bad thing. That's a more good, right? We're talking about people using energy, but also creating energy. Now, some people object to the aesthetics, a lot of solar panels, right? However, you think about, I look at telephone poles, you look at telephone poles all the time, you don't really think about it. Solar panels are like telephone poles. They're a necessary utility for us to get to where we need to go. So Tim's projects where they're getting to net zero really are something that you're going to see a lot of in the next 5 to 10 years. The other thing you're seeing in Philly is something called Passive House. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's a German system that measures the efficiency of a house. So these are super, super efficient houses. It's really simple. It's like when you're cold at night, you can either crank the thermostat and use energy and pollute, or you can just get more blankets. So Passive House is basically like 30 blankets on your house.
Oh,
right?
wow.
Right. So that, and your body heat, there's enough heat between you and the refrigerator that your house is actually warm with almost no heat at all. And so you take that plus solar, Darryl, and you've got essentially a zero impact house or a net zero impact house, ultimately getting towards something called carbon neutrality, which is really the end game where we as humans live on the planet, we use energy, but we create energy, and our impact starts to become zero. That's the only way we're going to persist as a species on this planet. We don't really have a choice. Not many people have seen that yet. Hopefully they will.
Now, with everything, right, we were talking about systems earlier, there's a balance, right? And there's going to be some give and some take here from an economics perspective and from a business perspective. How does that then change the game from that perspective, right? Because at the end of the day, economics and the economy, plays a major role in how things are and the impact that they're able to make. So how do you foresee that changing?
Yeah, and I think it's a fair question, and people say, well, this is what I know, I don't want to work. People always say, well, Rob, how much more is it going to cost? And I say, well, how much more than what? A bad building that's polluting the environment? What I would argue is that our whole economic framework is backwards. We look at things from a short-term return on investment. I'm going to put money in, I need money out right away. And that is not a long-term sustainable option. So just like we're talking about long-term environmental health, we've got to begin to stretch out the return on investment. If I invest $1 million, am I willing to wait 7 years instead of 1 year to get that money back? If we don't fundamentally change our economic paradigms, we're never going to fully be able to realize quickly sustainable design alternatives and opportunities. So I just think that the thing's all backwards. I think that a lot of people who talk about money are thinking short term. And we've got to flip the script on that, Darryl. We've got to get folks to start thinking long term, or we're not going to be able to make the changes that we need in society right now.
So would you say that you're optimistic about the future of sustainable design?
I am today. So Darryl, like I told you, I'm hitting up to my 25th year. You're going to come to my big party We're going to have it at Franklin Institute. We're going to be in that big.
In the rotunda. Okay.
Yeah, I'm plugging for a venue here, right? So,
yeah.
I hadn't thought about that. It's pretty good. So here's the thing: sustainability goes in waves, right? So we had a big wave in the 80s with energy efficiency. We had a wave in the 90s. We had a huge wave in the early 2000s. It's been gone for a while. Let's all admit it. We've gone through an anti-science period. I'm being polite. And now we're about to go through the fourth wave of sustainability and sustainable development. And Darryl, every time we go through another wave, the impacts get better and better. Change doesn't happen in a constant. You can't just assume that you're just going to fly off in the sunset. You're going to go up, you're going to go down. And trust me, we're down. We know what down looks like. We're in it. But we're about to take another, not just nationally, but global leap towards really getting our climate under control. And after COVID, and I think we can finally start to have some optimism, you're going to see fighting climate change as the #1 priority globally. And you're going to see a lot of money and effort and science being put into what are called deep retrofits. Every building in Philadelphia will be retrofitted. All existing buildings will be retrofitted and get 50% more efficient in their energy use. You're going to see all of these amazing things happen. So yes, I can't say I'm eternally optimistic, but I am optimistic right now that we are on a good trajectory.
That's exciting to hear. That's very exciting to hear. So there's a couple of questions that came in. I'm just going to ask.
This is the part I get worried, Darryl.
No, that's okay. No, this has been a really fun conversation.
Good.
So what are some low-cost sustainability recommendations that everyone can consider as part of daily practice?
Okay, so I get this question a lot. I want to talk a little, just briefly about recycling. Let's not assume that recycling is the gift of sustainability. There's a lot of energy involved in recycling. I want everybody to recycle, but we got to go on to the next level. We got to repurpose. We got to not throw out. We got to buy things that are going to last. The goal that we have now in everyday living is to buy products that you're going to keep for a long time. This fast fashion thing, really not sustainable, right? We want to buy clothes at thrift stores that have classic aesthetics that we can wear. We wear them for 5 years, put them in the closet. When it comes back around, it's in style again. You pull it out. I know you have your thin 80s tie. And so, we've got to reassess and rethink our relationship with our products.
Yeah.
And really try to have a different, and it all comes down to different mindset. Every time we dig down, it's all about thinking differently. So obviously, you got to live near where you work. If you can walk to work. So I lived really close to my job. I was able to have one car for 13 years. Most people go through a car in 6 years because they live far away from work. Where we live, how we live, the zip codes we choose, how we reinvest in our communities and make our communities strong is ultimately going to create a livable, sustainable economy. And I'm being a little more vague than I think the caller probably wanted, but my job as a professor is always dig into the principles. So, again, reassessing our relationship with the things that we're buying for sure.
So you released this book with some colleagues called Sustainable Design Basics. And this is really, I think, in the context of really sort of the built environment, right? But some of these basics, and I don't know if folks can see this book title here.
Cover.
It's a great cover, right? So I'm just curious, what are some of these design basics that even span across thinking about the built environment?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, shout out to the co-authors, Sharon, Mark, Seglinda. Great time working on the book. It was really hard to write that book, Darryl. Every day I was like, oh my God, we're trying to explain something that's relatively complex. But let me give you some basics. When you're in the winter and you get in your car and it's sunny, have you noticed that your car is warmer? Right? So that's a basic principle. We're talking about basic physics here. I told you about Passive House and the insulation and the blankets, right? So there are a lot of one-time cost and low-cost things that you can do. Where you put your window shades and how you let light into your building or not. I mean, these are really simple. We're not talking about solar panels or fancy equipment. We're talking about really smart things that people have been doing for centuries and centuries and centuries. A lot of sustainable design basics is stuff that people knew. We know where the sun is. It's in the south. We can collect that heat. We can shade that. We know it's cold on the north. We know the west light is going to blind us and make us overheat. So no windows on the west side, Darryl, sorry. No windows,
My house is south facing.
Oh, so you're good. So you're getting a lot of heat gain in the window.
And I don't have windows on this.
So you're already ahead of the game. That's good passive design. Row houses. Are you in a row house, Darryl?
I'm in a row house.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're sharing heat with the two houses next to you.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes you
actually one house. Yeah. I'm on end. I'm an end unit.
Oh, okay. So we'll have to talk about that. Yeah, you're taking a hit on that. So that's okay. So in that book, we lay out all kinds of really simple passive things you can do. And then after you do those, you can then do the cool stuff. And you can do the PV, but only after. You got to eat your vegetables, do the things that are needed to be done, and then you can have your dessert and do all the cool tech stuff that you want to do.
And then, so what are some ways for folks to, I mean, again, they're new to this concept of sustainability. They're just learning what this term means, and we've given them some examples, but what are some easy ways for folks to get started? You know, what's one thing that folks can do just even today that they can start changing?
I'm gonna surprise you, Darryl, and I'm gonna say go to school. And when I say go to school, I don't mean take college classes necessarily. I mean start learning how to think differently. The key is to split that switch in your head and look at the world differently. I know that wasn't the answer you were looking for, by the way. I'm aware of that, but I just want to put a plug in for that. Last summer, Darryl, I taught my course for free to the world, where I teach people how to think differently. And I'm sure I'm going to be launching that course again. It's a lot of work to do, but we got it. So that I would say is the first thing. And I'm just thinking again, like, it's not what you can do immediately. It's how you prepare for life changes. You know, you're going to buy the next house. You know, you're going to buy the next car. You know, you're going to get a new hot water heater. You know, you're going to go to the supermarket and start thinking about the healthy foods, the local foods, the low impact foods, right? So it's more about preparing for those moments rather than doing anything special. Because as soon as you make it special and you got to work harder, people tend to go back and take the path of least resistance, you know? So again, I'm not giving you the easy answer here, but I'm gonna leave it at that.
Okay. Well, I'm curious too. So, and we talked a little bit in this conversation about COVID, and there was the pre-COVID world, and now we're in, you know, right smack in the middle of the COVID world. Yep. Has COVID changed in terms, you know, any perspectives, any shifts in thinking about sustainable design?
Oh, Darryl, I got some good news and bad news on this. First of all, bad news for all the people that have suffered. Let's just get that on the table and have this discussion. Honestly, from a sustainability point of view, carbon emissions are very low right now. And the fact that you and I are here on Zoom and I didn't drive to the Franklin Institute or take the train, the fact that no one is driving and we're still moving society forward, we're talking about a transformation in the amounts of energy that are needed in order to provide basic services like education and communication. So, and the other thing, Darryl, that I wish people would think more about, I saved 5 hours a week because of what's happening with Zoom and our universities closed. I don't want that 5 hours to disappear. I think people should take whatever time they saved and put it into something really special, whether it's something, and preferably something meaningful for society. So for me, I took that 5 hours. I work on diversity, equity, inclusion, privilege, every week for 5 hours. I'm like, this is the time that I used, and I'm going to do it. And now that's what I do. And now I'm smarter and better and learning, right? So I would ask everybody who's listening, capture that time where you're not commuting and use it for something to make the world better. So yes, I mean, we're proving the point that Zoom and online communication can work and we can have real discussions. And there you go. That is a revolution in communication technology for sure.
Mm-hmm. And then, and going back to sustainable design and design as a practice, are there any shifts in thinking has COVID ushered in some new thinking in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit more, and this is again, good news, bad news. I had a friend who has a client, they were doing 100,000 square foot building. They were working on it, COVID hit, project stopped, came back 3 months later. Can you cut that building down to 50,000 square feet? We don't need all that space. Now, the bad news, of course, for the architect, that's bad news, less fee. But for the world, it's a good thing, right? The smaller the building, the less energy footprint, the less impact on the environment. We're talking about a real sea change there in terms of how we think about the built environment and how much is really needed, how much space is really needed. And like I said, bad for architects, better for society, if I can answer the question that way.
That's interesting too, just to watch Philadelphia change. You know, before we started the program today, we were talking about our connection to Philadelphia and moving back and watching the development that's happening here in the city, and the number of buildings that are popping up. I'm curious too, since you are in the architecture sector, how, just looking at the type of buildings that are popping up around the city, and this focus on not so much high rises, even though there are a number of high rises going up in center city, but in other sections of the city, the prevalence of more row homes.
Yeah, I know where you're going.
So I'm just curious, like, what's your thoughts in terms of how the city is developing?
Yeah, I'm frustrated, Darryl. I have to be. I'm generally a positive person, but I would see the majority of the buildings going up are not doing the things that we're talking about today. They're not adding the insulation. They're not adding the shading. They're really trying to flip a profit quickly, and they're building the least quality buildings they can build in the shortest amount of time. That's not universally true, but it's generally true. And so, there are folks out there like Community Ventures, is a nonprofit developer doing great work and sustainable work. But for every one of those, there's 10 others. I would really challenge people listening, put that extra 1% in, put that extra 2% of the budget for the good of humanity and for the good of the future. The other thing is that, gentrification, we think of sustainability as an environmental thing, but imagine a future where, let's say, Darryl, we solve the sustainability problem from an environmental point of view, but we live in an unjust society where one group of people has the advantage over another. That's not the future I want. So for me, I can't focus on just environmental issues. I've got to focus on social issues. And I think there's a lot of question marks right now about what's happening in the city and how really strong neighborhoods are being torn apart by outsiders coming in and maximizing profit. And I would love, if anybody's listening and wants to work with me on a sustainable gentrification model, please send me a note. I want to work with you. And I think we've got to crack the code of that. Philly is gentrifying, and it doesn't have to be as destructive as it is right now.
And Philly's not unique in this. Other cities around the country and maybe even around the world are adopting the same model. So where are there places where we can go or we can learn some evidence-based practices of how to get this right? Or would we be leading in that work if we were to really lean in on that?
Yeah, I'll be honest, we're getting a little outside of my zone of expertise, the zone that I'm growing and getting more smarter. Can you be more smarter? So I don't really have the answer to that. I do a lot of reading on it and a lot of thinking about it. I think there's got to be a different model for gentrification. Those neighborhoods in West Philly, North Philly, South Philly, those neighborhoods were disinvested and redlined historically. So folks never really were able to accumulate equity in their houses and wealth, which puts them at a disadvantage and at the mercy of developers who can send checks to folks, really big checks that look good on the surface. But if those folks could hold on to their houses for 3 or 4 years, they would make a much better profit. But sometimes they can't. They got to sell their house. They got to pay the bill. I totally get that.
Right. Yeah. I think this is a separate conversation that maybe for another time. But I mean, you're hitting and touching on some major points here, which I think are worth digging into. I want to circle back because a lot of this too is really about education for formal education and how we have these conversations in schools, but also to public and communication and how this is the conversations that folks have. But I'm curious too, thinking about, do you work with pre-college educators and young students, and are there, if not, do you have plans to do some of that work to really help promote sustainability in that context?
Yeah, Darryl, this is something I'm personally really interested in. I'm really interested in pre-K all the way up through PhD, and how can we create on-ramps for folks to get into these professions and have a successful career and make the kinds of impacts that they want. Sadly, architecture is not a diverse profession. I don't know if you're aware of this, but architecture schools are only 5% African-American on average, and it is a travesty. So the problem there is you've got one group of people making decisions and shaping the built environment that impacts lots of groups of people. So there's not equity in that. So the last year, and this has been part of the 5 hours a week, we're building a roadmap for students of color who want to become architects, engineers, interior designers, who want to shape the built environment, but maybe don't have somebody in their family who was already an architect, or maybe don't have a lot of wealth, so they don't see architecture as a pathway. We've got to change that. One of the great stepping stones, Darryl, is the Community College of Philadelphia. People don't know, but out of high school, you can do 2 years at community college, get a good foundation, and transfer into an accredited school of architecture. And you have to take a test to become an architect. And it's not an easy test. So having these pathways are really critical. And then going back down to K through 12, and what are happening in the high schools? What's happening in middle school? Philanoma, the National Organization of Minority Architects, they do a summer camp for kids, teaching them about sustainability on Saturdays, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. So you will be hearing about this. We haven't actually got our website up, but we're building a new program to support kids as they want to get into these built environment and these built environment professions, which are STEM, by the way.
They are absolutely STEM.
Maybe Steve, we might put, as you started off, you might put the A in there and call it Steve.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of tech in there, which is important.
Absolutely. No, this just reminds me, some of the work that the Franklin Institute has done in this regard too. We have a longstanding program called PACS, which is Partnerships for Achieving Careers in Technology and Science. It's been around over 25 years. And one of the components that we teach our kids, middle schoolers, is architecture is one of the aspects of that programming. And those students get a chance to engage with architecture professionals and really do some cool hands-on work to learn more about architecture. But I agree, it's an area or career pathway that is definitely has a lot of underrepresentation of minorities, and so a lot of room for improvement there, as you said. So we're almost at time. This has been such a great conversation. I'm curious too. I asked you about your optimism around sustainability. I do still think, the takeaway is that you are a huge advocate and proponent and believe
I am
future impact of sustainable design without question. But I'm just curious, do you feel that we are particularly here, are we heading in the right direction in terms of sustainable design becoming ubiquitous, or is there still a high mountain to climb?
I think we're still climbing, Darryl. I'm 24 years in. I honestly thought I'd be on my next career. I thought sustainability would have been done by now, but I think we're still climbing. And the reason I think we're climbing is we're not hardwired for it. We're not hardwired to think globally. We're not hardwired to think into the future, that far into the future. So we're actually rewiring our whole evolutionary approach to who we are on the planet. That's going to take a generation to really rethink that. And all the schools are changing, by the way, all the K through 12, everything is rearranging itself right now to wire for that. Mm-hmm. But our brains actually can change and evolve as we get new information. That is not happening fast enough for us. So we have 60 to 70 years of climate change baked in, no matter what we do now. So I would offer you, as in closing, the term resilience. And now a lot of my time is spent, well, how do we adapt to these changes that are coming? We're seeing the heating, we're seeing the heat with the hurricanes, the forest fires. So now a lot of sustainability also includes adaptation and resilience, which is not fun, but an important part of what we're doing. So no, I think we're still pushing the boulder up the mountain, Darryl.
And then how can we learn from nature too? Nature oftentimes gives us a lot of answers, and sometimes we just sort of circumvent nature, but how can we look at nature to gain inspiration to help us solve some of these problems?
Darryl, I'm so with you. The term biomimicry, you probably heard them.
Right.
The term biophilia, these are amazing terms. Unfortunately, they're used sometimes as a buzzword. However, I do think that we have to get through that human-centric view to be able to be in a place where we can learn from nature. Nature moves slowly and it moves carefully and it evolves, versus us, who we move so quick and we're always conquering, right? That's our short-term thinking. And so again, reprogramming our minds to be more in tune with nature, like the original hunter-gatherers, and rediscovering some of those interrelationships. They would burn the forests, right? Native Americans would burn the forests on purpose to prevent giant forest fires, to protect their hunting grounds. That is a symbiotic relationship with the natural world. We do not have that. We have major forest fires and then we get all upset. So we've got to relearn. We have a lot to relearn and a lot of ego check that has to happen in the next decade or so.
It's interesting. I feel too, and 2020 and COVID has really, at least for me, and I'll speak for myself, this idea of humility, is really, I think, a major reflection that I've had. I mean, who would have thought that something like this would come in and really just transform and shake up everything? But it's definitely shown us that we need to be a little bit more respectful and humble, just as humans, and hopefully, that's something that will carry on, at least, beyond this event.
Let's hope.
I'm very thankful that you were able to spend time with us today. Very insightful conversation, Rob, and congratulations on your program, the success of your program. Look forward to hearing more from you. It sounds like you have some really exciting things coming down the pike that are not only going to impact Philadelphia, but also impact nationally and maybe even internationally. So just really excited. We'll keep the pulse on you. I want to challenge you to that Jenga game. I'm looking forward to your 25th anniversary shindig. And then I do want to just remind folks that you do have a book. Now, this is not really a book for, is this a book for leisure, or is this more of a textbook? How would you describe this book?
It's totally a textbook.
Okay.
I have another book called Sustainable Design for the Built Environment that's a little more leisurely and general in scope, that also came out last year as well. So that one you can get, that's from Routledge. They're all available on Amazon. If you just type my name in, you'll be able to see those books and have some more fun. That one's a pretty hardcore textbook though.
Okay, but definitely, the takeaways here is that this is about the basics for executing sustainable design, right?
That's correct. A lot of science in there too.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll have you back and we can talk some more specifically about some of these design basics.
I would be more than happy to do that.
Very good. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope you got a lot out of this conversation. Definitely a lot to talk about, and fodder for future discussions related to sustainability and sustainable design. I want to encourage everybody to stay safe and healthy this Thanksgiving. Enjoy Thanksgiving with family and loved ones if you have the opportunity to spend time with them. And we will see you next time here on Engineering for Good. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.